Done a lot of genetic testing. This is the first one. Kashif knew my personality and my tendencies before he met me. I was like, stop.
I'm going to backbite a little bit about you right now.
This man is very smart. Okay, welcome, Kashif.
Thank you. So starting with what was just said about living to 120, why do we even say that number? So first, to answer that, what is aging? If we're trying to understand anti-aging, how do we even get to aging? So if you look at every one of the 50 trillion cells that makes up the human body, every single cell has DNA in it. And think of DNA as like an instruction manual. So you have this little book inside every cell. The kidney cell reads the kidney page and knows how to do its job. The heart cell reads the heart page and so on, right? So as that DNA gets oxidized, damaged, wear and tear from your choices from environment, food, stress, etc., the integrity, the structural integrity gets compromised, the cell starts to unravel to some degree, and you start to see that inward aging poke its nose out with the white hair and the wrinkly skin, etc. So that damage at the cellular level, starting with the DNA inside the cell from oxidation, just like rust on metal, is what is happening when you age. So the big aha moment right up front is the number 120 comes from this, that on either end of your DNA, there's a protective cap called a telomere. And some of you may have done some biological age testing where you look for telomere length, and it's some level of indication of how old you are on the inside versus your birth certificate, right? So that telomere, that cap as a physical structure, we now know is designed to last 120 years. So you may have read this prior, religiously, it's in the Bible. You may have heard this from, biohackers saying that that's the right number. So the wisdom's been around for a while, and now we know why. Because of the structure of that protective bumper. So the question then becomes, why don't we get there, right? Why aren't we living to 120? And that question is a very American-centric question. Because if you look at this country, or Canada, where I came in from, the top reasons why people die are all rooted in inflammation. In fact, the top 15 reasons why people die here are, of the 15, 14 are chronic disease based in inflammation, right? Which means we didn't really get to our potential because we caused damage that took years away. And why am I saying all this stuff? Because everything that you're going to see below us and above us, it's all great. I do all this stuff. I'm not saying anything is bad, but I am saying that this stuff should be more about life extension than trying to, once again, band-aid or take a pill for our poor choices, right? We already have 120. We're wired for that. That's a gift we've been given. The reason we don't get it is what we need to explore. It's more about things that we need to take away than add. And the adding is all good once the terrain has been established and ready for the benefit of that thing you're going to add, right? Which is why some people say, I took that supplement, it didn't work, it's a scam, or I did the stem cell therapy, I still don't feel good. The terrain wasn't ready. The terrain wasn't ready. If you can't start fixing something if the problem you're causing is still there, get rid of the problem first, then get into repair, right? So, based on that, we now know that the average American gets their first chronic disease at 55, 2 by 65. Typically, the last 15 years are spent in treatment. That's the current American average. There are places today where people do live to 110, 115, 120. And if you look at what they're doing, their habits are aligned to the local jurisdiction where they're from. Take Okinawa, take Sardinia. We've heard of these blue zone type places, right? And if you look at the habits, they're doing the same thing that their ancestors did in the same place with the same genetic blueprint. They're designed for those habits. Then you take a place like this, we're all from somewhere else and we're all doing the same thing, and what we're doing also is not what we're designed for. And then you're not surprised that we start chipping away at those years and taking years away. So I heard the question when I said this once, which is, well, how do we reverse? It's not possible. You take a country like Singapore, where they were, a generation ago, one of the lowest life expectancies on the planet, and now they're one of the highest, top 5. They flipped it in a generation. And once again, they just looked at the habits that were taking years away before they started adding anything, made those habits very expensive with fines and made things illegal that are not illegal here, and all of a sudden people are healthy. So, if we know what takes years away and we start there, the toxins that cause the oxidation, that damage the telomere, that reduce our biological age, you now build a terrain that's ready for the benefit of all this stuff. So as examples of some of that, why do I know what I know? So I started a genetic research company, not because I was heavily educated or had a PhD, because I was sick and wanted to figure things out and heal myself. So I had eczema, psoriasis, gut issues, migraines, depression, didn't want to get out of bed, and multiple doctors. The first time in my life I actually needed a doctor, I was 38 years old, and didn't understand what doctors did. And the toolkit of we will fix the acute pain, but not ask where it came from, I didn't understand. And I was asking, this can't be a coincidence that all these things happen at the same time. What did I do? What did I eat? What did I breathe? I must have touched something. What did I do? And I couldn't get that answer. So that drove me down this path of discovering functional medicine, naturopathy, homeopathy, traditional Chinese medicine, until I landed on my unique genome, sitting in front of a PhD, understanding that when me and my business partner lived on the same street, were the same age, same food, same ethnicity, we worked together all day, we ate lunch together every day, I was sick and he wasn't. So I believed when I was told you have these things that you have them. Because why doesn't he have them? We do everything the same. My genome showed me a couple things I'll tell you. There's a gene pathway called GSTM1. You've seen people talking about glutathione here. In fact, you can get an IV right up there for glutathione. It's an antioxidant your body uses to neutralize and remove toxins. There are specific genes that instruct how various parts of your body deploy glutathione. GSTM1 is responsible for your gut. So as you eat, whatever you consume, the toxins, mold, pesticides, whatever come along with that food, this is supposed to activate a first line of response, neutralize, bind, pee it out, poop it out, sweat it out. That gene in my human instruction manual doesn't exist. It's missing. So it's not even about a version or a variant. I literally don't have the instruction. There's no defense. So when me and my business partner were going to lunch every day, and we were eating what we thought was healthy, this Mediterranean diet, I didn't know that where I lived in Canada, there's drying agents used on grains so that we can store them in the winter because it's cold and we have short farming windows. And those, for me, are very toxic, but for Health Canada and FDA studying them, they're not, because most people aren't missing this gene pathway. But then when we come to our clinical work, which I now do, 60% of the people that we work on are missing this gene pathway. When the general population, it's 5%. But you look at people that are stuck that can't figure it out, there's a unique genetic flaw, let's say, that is preventing them from doing a job that they assume that their body's doing. The second thing that held me back, that I learned, there's a neurochemical in your brain called dopamine that allows you to experience pleasure, satisfaction. When you enjoy food, when you achieve something, pleasure, reward, these are both leading you to satisfaction. Dopamine is the thing that gets bound in your brain that allows you to experience that satisfaction. There's a gene for each step of that pathway, and you can intervene at each step to know which one's broken. For example, DRD2 determines the intensity level. There's receptors in your brain that actually bind the dopamine, and how many receptors do you have dependent on one gene. The duration, the clearance of the dopamine to get you back to your baseline behavior is determined by a protein called COMT. So I have the lowest level or density of dopamine receptors in my brain. I had the fastest possible COMT protein. So I am wired for, academically, if you were to read the textbooks, depression, because I can't feel satisfaction. Other textbooks, depending what school you might go to, will say addiction, because I can't get satisfaction. But I didn't have either of those things going on. I did when I was sick, but not when I studied this stuff. Dopamine also powers reward. And I was on this highly entrepreneurial reward-seeking path because once I healed myself, I wanted to heal everybody. And the satisfaction I was getting from that, I didn't need the pleasure anymore. But the way that I was working, building 10 different companies at one time, I burnt myself out. My brain was capable of plowing through whatever stress I could take on, but my body couldn't keep up. So my nervous system was fried, and that was one of the reasons I was sick. Fight or flight. My body was broken. So this pathway was not designed for today's reality. The same with every pathway I can talk about. I was designed for, the tribe was fine, everything was good, we plucked plants out of the ground, killed a moose once in a while, and when there was a calamity, I was the guy that stepped up and fixed it. Not chronically every day all the time. Just like the broken gut gene. Didn't need it when only once in a while there was a struggle, but not when you live in a toxic American food environment. And just the same when it comes to your hormones, your metabolism, we can talk about your detox pathways. There's good and bad, but none of that biology assumed what today would look like. Our DNA hasn't changed for 250,000 years. Go back 250,000 years, try and find a fossil, you're going to find the same DNA in whatever species you pluck out of the ground. It hasn't changed. There's variations that have been passed around, but no evolution or change. So the vast majority of our biology assumes we still live that same life. Why was I in fight or flight? Because human biology assumes and can handle 5% of your waking day being in high stress. Not what we live today, the flip opposite, 95%. Beyond it's supposed to be acute, of problems. You dropped a hammer on your foot, now you fix it, right? It was not supposed to be chronic every day, all the time, which is why the nervous system of everyone is the place we start. And that's the next thing I would talk about. Order of operations. When we're doing all this great stuff and things don't work, so I'm trying to speak to where we get stuck and where do we optimize and really solve big problems. Typically, running to whatever looks fun and enjoyable, okay, it may work one day, get the nervous system right first. And I talked about one potential, which is, do you experience no dopamine like me, seeking reward? Or maybe it's too much, and you have too much dopamine in your brain, and you're highly content, and you have too much anxiety because of the way your body's procrastinating against reward, because you're already satisfied, don't need it, right? Completely different perception based on 1 out of 22,000 genes. It could also be, I'll give you an example, after I healed myself, I then spent the next 3 years on a genetic research study where we studied 7,000 people. Everything from breast cancer to autism to hair loss, libido, you named it, we studied it. Genome in hand, medical history in hand. One of the things we did in studying the brain was looked at the Navy SEALs. So there's a group called the Liminal Collective that works with the Navy SEALs on their biohacking. And they asked us to come in and to understand, why do some of these soldiers get trauma and some don't? And they're very expensive soldiers, they're very important soldiers, they needed to be in top shape, right? So here's what I showed them. Starting with nervous system in terms of order of operations. We always start here irrespective of what we're working on. If you're in fight or flight, the other stuff doesn't work, right? Rest and recovery doesn't work. So here's what we showed them. There's a gene pathway called ADRA2B, ADRA2B, which drives your adrenaline response. Now imagine a soldier pulling the trigger in that kind of impactful stimulus, that level. That's an adrenaline rush. We know what that feels like, right? This gene pathway determines your regulation of adrenaline, and adrenaline gives you two things. In that moment, you're capable of more. When your adrenaline is upregulated, you're bigger, faster, stronger, you are that super soldier temporarily. The other thing it does is it records information. Because that moment is so important, your brain wants to not make that mistake again, because it can't tell what the threat is, it just knows how you feel. And so it will imprint. And if your genetics around adrenaline aren't wired properly, not only do you imprint the intellectual component of what you just went through, you also imprint the emotional component, which we're not supposed to. Some people genetically wired to bind trauma, and some aren't. And so that was one half of the story. We showed them that over and over and over again, the soldiers that we looked at of the Navy SEALs that were struggling had this adrenaline dysregulation, either because they made too much and maintained too much recall around the emotion, or they cleared it too slow, so they were in the moment for way too long, binding too much information. Second, there's a gene pathway called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And it drives brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a primary nutrient for neuroplasticity, your brain developing itself. So every time you learn something, every time you develop a new skill, your brain grows, and it's through BDNF, that fertilizer that makes your brain. If this gene isn't working properly, you don't have effective neuroplasticity, and when you experience something new, impactful, important, you have to produce new neurology to process that, and sometimes you do that too slow because of this gene pathway, which means that thing feels like a much bigger deal. It feels heavier, it has more meaning, it has more weight. So now imagine the combination of I bind emotions because of my adrenaline dysregulation, because of a single gene, and I also give impactful moments a lot of weight because it takes me longer to process. That's a recipe for PTSD. So that person should have never been deployed in active combat. They should have been the researcher, the scientist that thinks deep because of how their brain slows down and wants to go deeper and deeper and deeper, not surface level because of the BDNF. So that I'm pointing this out because there's not one single path to why somebody's nervous system would be overwhelmed. There's multiple gene pathways. You can talk about the brain, but all of us have different paths to the feeling, and we just work on the feeling as opposed to understanding how we got there. And we can't understand how we got there. And once you work on that, very easy. There's supplements that will upregulate these neurochemicals, downregulate them day to day, and you can actually decide how you feel. The scientist might decide, yeah, I want that deep life quality thinking when I'm researching, but I want it off on the weekend when I'm with the kids. You can actually change gene expression. So, nervous system first. Next is gut. Once the nervous system is regulated and the terrain is now out of fight or flight and ready to actually get some work done, then we start working on the gut. And there are many pathways we can talk about in terms of the genes that drive what state you're in. The one I talked about in terms of detox response, but then your choices around your food. The conversations around things like oxalates and whether you're a vegan diet, whether you're carnivore, whether you're keto, there's a gene that will tell you already what the right answer is. Some people will tell you, I had a kale salad and with spinach, I'm just fine. Somebody will say, I can't eat spinach because of the oxalate. And you're wrong, right? And that there's no right or wrong. There's bio-individual. We're not the same person. So we can't expect the same outcome from the same choice. So there's a gene pathway called FUT2, that's a methylation gene, that helps your body make the enzymes to break down plant foods, including plant proteins, beans, lentils, chickpeas, and leafy greens. That's primarily what it does. It also helps your body convert B12, which is important for anti-inflammatory and so many other things. But this single gene, we can tell you, should you be a vegan or not, right? And if you are, and you decide, say it's a religious reason and you're genetically not wired for it, what might you add to help your body do a better job because the gene isn't working? Somebody might decide to go on a keto or carnivore diet, upping their fat. And there's a pathway called ApoA2 that determines how effectively you can actually use fat as fuel. And if you're not doing a good job, fat ultimately becomes glucose, and that can cause diabetes. The thing that we say is a cure, which for most people, yes, it's true. But if you have this unique variant, that decision to go keto might literally lead to metabolic dysfunction. The same thing you were avoiding by getting rid of the starch, depending on a pathway, right? So the next layer we usually work on is the gut. After that's all done, we have to consider that today's reality is no longer grandma's reality. So when we say, I don't eat that cereal, when I don't drink that thing, and they're like, well, we used to do that and we were fine, the thing has changed. It's not the same thing anymore, right? We have 144,000 chemicals that have been added to humankind in the last few decades. You experience more toxins today, in this one day that we're here together, than 100 years ago somebody experienced their entire lifetime. One day, right? Those things didn't exist. And so, again, we have pathways around glutathione activity, antioxidative activity, something called methylation, glucuronidation. These are all important detox pathways designed for a reality that didn't look like this. Acute. The body is designed to deal with emergencies, acute response, not chronic all the time every day. And so for the third layer, once these two terrain considerations are ready, and the body's now ready to benefit from stuff, you have to think about your total toxic burden, and there's gene pathways that will tell you. For example, there was a research study that just came out like 2 months ago saying that we're seeing some good news around people using black seed oil to detoxify mold. And the reason that works is black seed oil drives a gene pathway called glucuronidation, which is the primary pathway your body uses to get rid of mold. So it's not that the black seed oil is driving mold out of your body, it's upregulating the expression of a gene that take one family doing a renovation, got rid of the kitchen, 3 people are fine, and 1 got really sick. And it's because of the mold, but why is it why didn't they get sick? Because the glucuronidation in mom wasn't working, and in dad it was, and the kids got dad's genes. The ability to process that particular toxin. And then we start to gaslight and blame because one person got sick and everybody else didn't. So when it comes to plastics, when it comes to metals, when it comes to all these concerns about today's fragrances, all these, there are unique pathways that drive all these things out of our body. And why do I say this? Because it's hard to do everything. It's hard to be perfect. And if we can at least prioritize our bio-individual need to focus on what's not working for us, that priority will give you the biggest ROI. For some people it is mold, for some people it is the EMF, for some people it is the chemicals, for some people it is what they breathe. There's gene pathways that determine how effectively you filter what you're breathing. First line offense, 2 people walk into a cosmetic store, breathe some perfume, 1 has no problem, 1 gets a headache. And the other one says, you're weak, what's wrong with you? Because there's a pathway here that's meant to drive that glutathione activity of respiratory inhalation-based toxins. Some people aren't doing well there, and some people are doing exceptionally well. They walked into the same context and feel fine, right? So knowing the priority around your body's ability to deal with the environmental load today, another major, a step to allow you to do less and get more ROI, because you're only working on what you actually need to work on. When those few things are done, now the body's ready for all this stuff, right? When your mind is right, when your gut is right, when the toxins are out and the inflammatory level is low, the terrain is in best form, you're optimal, now you can start asking, how am I supposed to exercise? What is the right food for me? What are the right supplements, etc. They start to work, and they start to work really, really well. And all this great science and the ROI was supposed to give you then benefit from. And if I were to tell you You're now in this phase of optimization, and once you're there and you spend a few months, that's when you can start seeking life extension. So this stuff shouldn't be about the band-aid of, I don't feel good, I don't like medicine, maybe this will work, right? Although the acute problem dealing with functional testing, etc., will get you in a much better place, these are about life extension. They should be, meaning deal with the terrain first. Now, having said all that, the area where, and I didn't know this, the area where we see the biggest struggle, remember I spent 3 years studying 7,000 people to collect the data we have on what all these gene pathways do and what do we need to know for each person. What I didn't know until I started that work, unintentionally, was the most broken part was everything around women's hormone health. And when we were studying everything from breast cancer to dementia to anxiety, it always seemed like women were struggling more. I didn't know that. We got into the research. My own mother, hysterectomy. I was married to someone with breast cancer. It's been in my family, but I didn't recognize that there's this overwhelming problem over here, and I seem to be okay. And that's very commonly the story. 80% of dementias in women, 80% of rheumatoid arthritis, autoimmunity, lupus, anxiety. The number is 80% all the way down. So we started to research that and understand what's going on. And I then, for the first time, learned that women weren't included in medical research. You take 50% of the population and say, well, you're complicated, we're not going to have you here. And that's truly what happened. What is a research study about? Efficacy, it should work, safety, and also this thing needs to go to market. A lot of money was spent here, let's get this thing approved, right? So the 28-day cycle is very different than a daily male cycle, and so women were not included. That changed 25 years ago in like the late 90s, and some of the things that we're studying, what you see in a doctor's table today, typically got started studying 27 years ago. It takes a long time for medical innovation to land on a doctor's desk. So even then, it was postmenopausal women that were included, right? So the full understanding of the cycle wasn't really brought to the table. So I'm only saying this because the same thing happened in the biohacking world. Not for the nefarious intent or the, like, let's just get this thing sold and this is complicated. It was more so, when you picture biohacking, who do you picture? Where does the news come from? It's an industry that was designed by men for men. And not with any bad intent, that's who did it. Dave Asprey started it, then Ben Greenfield, then Gary Bracken, all these guys on board, Peter Attia, you hear all these guys studying stuff on themselves, saying, this is awesome, go try it. And then half the population try it, and it's like, sometimes it works great, and sometimes I feel worse. What's going on, right? With fasting, the cold plunging, all that stuff. And so when you look at the unique genetics of how hormones are made, metabolized, and cleared, very, very different in a female form than a male form. And so we studied this, and that became a good, without exaggeration, 95% plus of where our time then went from that point onwards, right? And so if you look at the female hormone cascade, what seems very gray and complicated can actually be made very black and white if you understood the genes of how do I make progesterone, testosterone, estrogen. After I make my estrogen, is that the last step, or do I convert it into something else? The thing that I converted it into, is that good for me or bad for me? If it's bad for me, how do I get it out of my body? Those are the actual considerations. It's kind of like plumbing. You start up here and each gene is a valve that directs which way things go. And you can look at the map and understand exactly what you're doing. And then you can test that child and tell her, with these habits, you're walking towards breast cancer. And with these habits, you're not. And it sounds oversimplified, but that's how simple it is. Something that's been made to be very complicated. And so when you take something like I mentioned, cold plunging, fasting, etc., we can look at the genetics and say that no, you should not, as a female, be, and this is not true for everybody, remember, bio-individual, some women should not be cold plunging every day. The same intention of this will make my brain feel good, and this will maybe burn fat because it's a major draw of calories, will create the stress that leads after a few weeks to fat retention because of how the hormones are receiving that acute stress. When you're more androgenized, stress is good. Stress leads to growth hormone, bigger, stronger, faster. When you're more estrogenized versus turning into a warrior, you turn more into a worrier. Stay back, protect the tribe. There might be a famine. I'm going to start storing some fat. Engage the nervous system, look for problems. That's what was the roles. Those were literally go to war, protect the tribe. And the more estrogenized female was designed for that. And I'm not saying every woman is wired like this, but I can tell you, of the women that we work on in our clinic, most are, which is why they're stuck and nothing's working, right? And then there's this consideration which we don't speak of medically, which is estrogen toxicity. And here's another area where if you were to go out there and talk to 10,000 people, 5% of women will be tested as estrogen toxic. When I talk to a room full of 100 women that have their DNA in their hand, that are stuck, can't figure out why things aren't working, it's usually about 70%. So it tells you how impactful this is on why women are stuck, and why before doing all this stuff, again, as a terrain consideration, there's one additional consideration: mind, gut, detox, then regulating hormones, especially for women, right? So it's an additional layer, which is why I separate it, important for women. So let me give you an example of how impactful this is, and the same story speaks to anxiety, dementia, it speaks to cardiovascular disease. But the example I'll give you is breast cancer, because it's the very first thing that I studied. It was the first clinic that said, yes, come here with your DNA and we'll work with you. 80% of their population was women with recurring breast cancer, so second, third, fourth bout of breast cancer. They're like, we know what to do. You figure out why they're here. Why does this keep happening? And that was our job, right? And that's what we wanted to do. And so I also bring it up because there's this scary word of the BRCA gene. How many women have heard of the BRCA gene? BRCA, the BRCA gene. So there's hands going up, right? So it's a common known thing. There was the Angelina Jolie effect where Angelina Jolie is told, you have the BRCA gene, go cut your breasts off, but option number one. And she did that. And not many men cutting their testicles off. So it's a very different way of approaching things, but it's profitable, right? So it gets done. So this is what Angelina Jolie was told, without ever asking, what does the BRCA gene do? Why do you think that this causes cancer? Is there like a switch that gets turned on? What does it do? And so this is the difference between genetics. Genetics is studying things in a disease setting, which is what all healthcare is. Well, our sick care system is, let's study sick people and let's use these genes with sick people to understand what's going on with the sickness, and maybe we can make a drug. Versus functional genomics, which is, why did they get sick? Just like healthcare is diagnose and prescribe, doctors diagnose and prescribe, and functional medicine is why. What did you do wrong, right? So genetics is BRCA gene, go cut your breasts off. Functional genomics is, if we look at your hormone cascade, in top of your habits, environment, nutrition, lifestyle, and combine them, now we have a total net story for who you are with your habit load on top of your genetic capacity to process those habits. So what is an actual clear story to breast cancer that does include the BRCA gene? The BRCA gene doesn't cause cancer, it's a tumor suppressor. So God forbid any woman here gets breast cancer, or any man, by the way, gets prostate or testicular cancer. This is the gene that will go start to suppress and kill the tumor. It's a repair tool, you need it. But if the gene isn't working so well, a certain version, it's not doing its job. So you're less likely to survive the cancer. But nowhere in there did we determine where it came from. So some women, through a gene pathway called CYP19A1, make too much estrogen, referred to as estrogen dominant, a term you maybe have heard. You can determine this again in a child before they start making choices that might hurt them. CYP19A1 takes your testosterone, aromatizes it into estrogen. Step one, right? Some women do that a little too well, so sometimes a good gene can be bad. Too much estrogen, bucket is full. Now, after making that, still not a problem, there's 3 potential metabolites: 2-hydroxyestrogen, 4 and 16. 2 is the good stuff you want, 4 and 16 cause inflammation. And you would ask, well, why does my body even have that option? Why would it make something bad? Because you didn't live in a hormone disrupting environment prior to now, where you were now overwhelming this net result of hormone toxin with more hormone disruption top of funnel, right? Overwhelming the total volume. So a little bit of inflammation is good. You go rip up your bicep at the gym to build it back. Some inflammation to your little uterine lining is good, builds back better. You can implant that embryo and get pregnant. A little bit is good. Too much is bad. So estrogen dominant, potentially also estrogen toxic, right? Second trait. There are innate detoxification systems built into your genetic wiring: glutathionization, antioxidation, methylation, glucuronidation, that are responsible to get this out. Those genes might not also be working. So you might have the trifecta of estrogen dominant, estrogen toxic, and don't detoxify that particular metabolite based on the gene that was responsible to do that. Now you're sitting there every month, every 28 days, making this stuff. And then, as an example, you might go into menopause. Most breast cancer happens post-menopause. No more period, primary path of removal, still making it, not escaping, not going, and your body starts to think, okay, this stuff is so dangerous, I want to keep it away from my heart, my liver, my kidney, my organs. Let's go put it in a safe pocket, and it puts it into your fat. And where do women have fat? here, and here, right? And so you have this monthly deposit of toxic estrogen being deposited into your breast tissue with other cellular structure like milk ducts and glands that were not designed to ever come in contact with a chronic load of toxin. So now there's a degradation of cellular structure, compromised integrity, cancerous tumor formation, and after all this was said and done, BRCA was supposed to do something. But it wasn't the starting point. But if you start at a woman that has breast cancer and you're only studying who didn't survive, you look at this gene trait because you're trying to make a drug. If you're trying to be functional about it, you can look at the cascade and starting from how did you make it, what quality was it, how did you detoxify it, then you start to say, that's the woman who has to be very careful with her bioidentical hormone replacement therapy. Why do we have this debate? Do hormones cause cancer or not? And why does one group say absolutely not? And one says, I got cancer 2 years later, and so did my friend. I didn't change anything else. And this debate exists in everything because we're not the same. We're not going to respond the same. So if you add estradiol, top of funnel, in a pathway that makes a lot of this 4-hydroxyestrogen, there's a gene called CYP1B1. How many women have heard of the CYP1B1 gene? Okay, there's a few here. The biohackers, I saw you. You guys don't count. So one minus you two, there's one. So why do I ask that question? How many hands went up for the BRCA gene, right? The fear-mongering, the go catch your breasts off gene, right? But for one person minus those two said yes to this. Why aren't you told? If I know this, every pharmaceutical company knows this, right? Why aren't you told? Because this is how you prevent. This is not how you treat. So if you do add estradiol top of funnel to a rapid CYP1B1 gene, you increase the volume of that 4-OH production. Because this gene sees the estradiol, and that's what it's supposed to do. And so now you can predict what you're going to do. If you add on top of this funnel, birth control pill, there's the warning on the box, may cause a stroke, may cause many things, including ovarian cancer, right? You still have a period at that point. So instead of getting accumulated here, it's going to accumulate here. And this is why young women with the BRCA gene are now being told to cut their fallopian tubes out to prevent ovarian cancer. But once again, there's a reason. It's the toxic estrogen that accumulates here during menses versus postmenopausal accumulates here. Same thing causing two different problems, right? So now you can make the choices to know, first of all, I'm making this. Hormone disruption and estrogen mimicry is a big deal to me. Got to purge my environment, clean things up. Have to add a couple of nutrients that slow the CYP. For every gene that we know is a problem, there's also a solution for how to speed or slow down its expression. That's all been studied. What supplements makes this gene work harder or slower? And so you can take, for example, DIM, which slows this gene down. You can add sulforaphane, which specifically targets toxic estrogen. You can drink some hydrogen, which also pulls toxic estrogen out of your body. So you can start to now focus on the right priorities and habits as opposed to a bucket full of pills, hoping that you did something right, because that's what an influencer said, right? And so everybody has their unique story. And so when you listen to that person online, the thing they're saying is probably will work for them, which is why they're speaking so loudly about it. But that might not be your story, right? And that might not be your priority. And this is why I'm saying everything here is good. I do all this stuff. I'm saying step one before doing all this stuff is who are you and what do you actually need to do? And if you do that, the ROI starts to look like what we said in the beginning of the people in Okinawa, Japan, where it's shameful to not get to 100. You know, like why not? Practice sense of purpose, have ikigai, eat the proper, have fermented food every day, and have the habits they have that are designed for the genetics, they get there regularly. And there would have to be some calamity or some anomaly why somebody didn't reach age with grace, not just age, but health span, right? They have quality years in their old age. So with that all being said, my intention was to sort of give you insights into genetics isn't about this gene equals Alzheimer's, good luck, right? Which is what we believe it is. Functional genomics, much like functional genetics is, or functional medicine, sorry, is we can choose what habits based on understanding the pathways as opposed to individual genes. We have to make choices anyway. What if you just always made the right choice? How good would you feel? How long would you live? If there are people in other cities living to 110, 115, 120 today, can't we also do that? If we remove the bad and add some good, but the good has to be somewhat personalized. And I'm hoping that the sort of anecdotes I gave you painted a picture of how possible and easy it actually is. It's not this weird science that's out of your control. It's actually very doable, and it's actually very simple because you end up prioritizing and only doing very little as opposed to doing everything. So with that, we're going to open the floor to questions if anybody has any. Yeah, go ahead. So with the testing, I have a bias because I built a genetic testing company, right? So Kat, who's standing in the back there with her hand up, she actually runs the show. So she has if you go downstairs and see her, she has a thing where you can get a test with a free consult. Typically, so how easy is it? Saliva swab? Yeah, saliva swab. It takes about a month. Usually, what you get in a report, if you were to do what it says, you're going to be optimal. If you blindly follow it and say, do this, don't do this, take this supplement, don't take this supplement, without worrying about a particular problem, that's your optimal biology. If there's a particular problem to solve, I would advise speaking to someone more in depth, right? But from what I understood, they're doing a free consult with a test during the show. It's usually the test on its own. So speak to Kat. So I think there's one precursor to that question is that if you're looking at genetics, I don't think it's so useful for everything we're talking about here. If you're looking at functional genomics, which is the pathways and systems, I think those are the two halves of personalization, functional genomics and the gut microbiome. So genetics is who am I? What is my wiring, right? Am I a Ferrari or am I an SUV? Both have their purpose, right? From brain to metabolism to everything. Second is where am I right now? That's gut microbiome. So we did a research project with McGill University there in Montreal, Canada, where I'm from, and we were trying to figure out fibromyalgia, right? So we came with the genetics, they came with the gut microbiome, we put everything together. They said fibromyalgia is based on toxic poop. What does that mean? That certain women that are eating the wrong food, that their gut microbiome wasn't designed for, the wrong bacteria start to flourish. The poop of that bacteria is highly inflammatory and causes fibromyalgia, but not every woman. That's where if the woman was also estrogen toxic, it went from maybe to certainly, right? So when you put the two together, it's like who am I at a baseline? Genes don't change. You're born with them, you die with them. Gut microbiome is where am I at today, right? And if you can put those two insights together, that's the whole picture. Yeah. So the data is the owner's manual, right? So now, typically there isn't a consult. Typically it's a test that you would read just the report. There's like over 100 pages of stuff to read, right? But yeah, we work with a lot of people in programs and groups and consulting them for even a year, or sometimes we'll work with pro athletes or celebrities on a whole 1 year deep dive into every piece of their biology, right? So it depends how deep someone wants to go. If you do follow the report with not a genetics test, which is very hard to action, it's more like looking for major alerts, like you have a rare cancer gene, for example. But if you follow what a functional genomics report would tell you, and you just do it all, that's your optimal you, right? But yeah, you can definitely go way deeper. Oh, huge. Yeah, I would say that's one of the bigger things we're working on today, especially vaccine injury-driven autoimmunity. It's a big part of what we're working on. So I'll give you one example. So, and there's many. So there is the same gene pathway that I said I'm missing for the gut detox. I don't know if you were here in the beginning when I said that, so I'm missing that. Some people have an extra copy. So there's a phenomenon in genetics called a copy number variation, which instead of like a variant, it's like how many copies of the gene did I get? And some people get extra copies. So some people are armed with this incredibly powerful gut detox first line defense. And now if you add on top of that toxic American food, it's somewhat too powerful of an engine you didn't need, and it leads to this hyper-vigilant detox response just constantly on because you're genetically wired to do such a good job. And eventually, the gut-brain connection, for every one signal your brain is sending down to your gut is sending 8 signals back. It has far more influence over your brain than your brain has over your gut. So if you are in this hyper-vigilant state, because this gene is working too well, your brain starts to say, this is not food, there's something else going on here. And it starts producing antibodies to fight a battle that doesn't need to be fought. And that leads to your own tissue getting affected in autoimmunity, right? So that's one. So we work with a lot of thyroid patients, Hashimoto's, rheumatoid, where this is one of the big profiles. That's like the root. So when we find that, we start to slow the gene down, start to deactivate with nutrients, and all of a sudden calm the source, right? Calm the source. And then over a period of months, 8, 9, sometimes 10 months, symptoms come down, right? But there's many examples. We don't know until we have your genome in hand which one it is, but this is one of the big ones. Yeah, so there are innate, so genetics is innate genetic conditions, which that thing you've heard of, like genes don't matter, the environment matters, because if the gene's not expressing, it doesn't matter. That's true for rare genetic traits, where they can be activated. For example, we're dealing with a young 5-year-old girl in Thailand right now, we got a call, who all of a sudden got type 1 diabetes. Out of the blue, right? Type 1, which is genetic, should have been at birth. but this rare trait it got expressed because of a viral infection she got, right? So the gene expressed. So that's true for genetics. Then there's a functional side of why was the body in such a disarray and when it comes to terrain where that was even possible, right? So what we have in our control is the functional side. We don't control the genetics, right? It's not understood well enough how to actually control those rare markers that turn things on and off. What we do control is if you understand metabolism, mood, hormones, sleep, gut function, and detox pathways, and you get all that stuff right, you now have emptied the bucket from 8 out of 10 to like 2 out of 10, and you can tolerate some bad choices, right? Whether it's your metabolism, whether it's breathing the wrong thing, and that's more in your control, right? So I would focus on that. That switch is hard to turn on and off. But if you do the work on the functional side and the train is right, the body will automatically turn the switch off. The greatest contributor to negative gene expression is negative emotion. There's nothing more powerful to turn bad disease genes on than to have stress, anxiety, and trauma. And the most beneficial habit for positive gene expression is positive emotion. Love, calm, meditation, prayer. Meditation is one of the only things we know that will actually lengthen your telomere length. The thing that I said is the measure of your biological age. You actually produce telomeres enzyme and they increase in length. So terrain first, which is why we always say that. Get them in the right mood, get the gut fix, etc. Fix all that, and then the body has the ability to heal that, right? Yeah, well, so if you have the report, we'll make recommendations on what to do. And you can either take a note to your doctor and say, here's what I was told, right? And if they don't cooperate, run. And then we can definitely recommend, there's people all over the place that are good at this stuff, right? Start with them first, but you can definitely, we'll give you it in writing, like here's the problem, here's what needs to change, and here's why. And most doctors will appreciate that if there's a reason, right? And if they don't work with them, right? If they're not willing to explore that, then I would not work with them. Okay, yeah, so there's two sides to that. There's pharmacogenomics, which is the genes that metabolize drugs. And I would say the place that's used the most is in all the psychodrugs, right? All the psychological. So that's the word pharmacogenomics, because it's the most trial and error, the most variable, right? So you can be very precise on terms of the actual drug that will work and which one will actually, could feel horrible. That's one layer. Then there's a layer of, does this person actually have a condition? Or are they wired for some kind of superpower that is creating some kind of kryptonite in them? Because they're not in the context that they were designed for, like me, right? I was designed for the warrior, entrepreneurialism. But I was burning myself out, not knowing how to structure, for example. There's a clinic in Toronto, there's actually a hospital that we worked with on exactly this, depression, addiction, even suicide, right? And so we spent a good 6 months with them. And I would say, if I were to give it a number, about 80% of who we worked on should not have been diagnosed. It was about that, I would say, right? Once we understood the pathways and how they perceived the world. So simple example, serotonin is referred to as this happy hormone, right? And what we don't understand is the biology of why it would change your mood. So what serotonin actually does is it regulates your brain's ability to prioritize information. So if we're all sitting here, some of you are looking at this and hearing this, and some of you are like, who are these people in the background, and why is she standing up? Distracted by information, right? Versus focused. So serotonin allows your brain to see this or see this. Now, if you are wired for experiencing the world at a higher level of detail, which was meant to be a leadership trait, it was meant to be the leader of the tribe that would notice the weather's changing or there's an animal, whatever. That was a genetic benefit. When today, there's so much stimulus, it becomes overwhelming, right? And starts to feel like I'm always irritated, I'm always frustrated, I'm never happy, people are so disappointing. You said it was going to be like this and like that and like that, but then you showed up 2 minutes late, and why does 2 minutes matter to the other person? So perception is completely changed by one neurochemical, which over time leads to constant high cortisol response, cortisol addiction eventually, and they're stuck, right? So all these, and this is why I said earlier, acute. All these genetic unique traits were meant for acute response. Once in a while, temporary, I turn on my superpower and I lead. Not every day, all the time. So yeah, I would say 80%-ish of what we worked on, we were able to find the thing that was driving perception change, why it was actually somebody's superpower, teach them the context they were designed for, and all of a sudden they start to feel amazing, right? But there also is pharmacogenomics, which is how do I actually metabolize a drug to get it right off the bat if you need to, right? So telomere will tell you biological age, right? This is the actual version of various functional genes you have. So how do you metabolize foods? How do you make hormones? How do you perceive the world based on levels of neurochemicals in your brain? How do you detoxify, right? So it just essentially, what are my habits? What should they look like, right? That's what the intention is. Yeah, and so in telomere length is really a measure of how old you are on the inside. How much wear and tear have your cells received, like abuse. Yeah. Yeah. Methylation is one important system. And this is where, once again, because of the pharmaceutical drive towards what we should test, right? Things are broken up and separated. And so methylation is a very important system. Also gets commonly gets separated as here's a methylation test, right? But that's one phase of a detox system. Right? It's not the entire flow. It's kind of like just looking at the plumbing on one side, not the rest of the house. You don't really get the whole story. So there are phases, so you have to look at all of them to make a proper call. Methylation is very important for metals and non-water soluble toxins. It also manages gene expression, so your adaptability and how quickly your body adjusts. It also helps you convert nutrients so you can absorb them. But yeah, so methylation is one part, but there's other parts you need to know with certainty what action to take. And this is where the breaking up of things is designed around, just pharmaceutical, right? Yeah. Does that make sense? Or yeah? Oh, yeah. So methylation sitting in between glutathionization, antioxidation, and glucuronidation. Those are the full systems that all interconnect to phase 1 and 2 detox. Then you know all of what's going on. Yeah. Yeah. So the systems tested are mood and behavior, executive function. How does your brain work? How do you make neurochemicals? How do you bind them? How do you clear them? So the intensity level of each feeling and how long did the feeling last? That really tells you who you are. And it's black and white. If I have your DNA, I can describe your personality to a T. I don't need to talk to you, right? So yeah, it's a swap. Yeah. So mood, sleep, diet, hormones, detox, and then chronic disease markers. I mean, there are some important markers that aren't, hopefully this doesn't turn on. They're actually actionable. So things around quality of hardware, like why might somebody get cardiovascular disease versus kidney versus cancer? There are genes that could tell us that, so they can not only deal with the habits, but actually fortify the hardware. For example, cardiovascular disease usually doesn't start in the heart. It usually starts in the arteries. So inflammation, plaque, calcification. So the inner lining of the artery is called the endothelium, right? This lining inside your artery. It's a single cell membrane. And the quality of that tissue is determined by a single gene, 9p21. So you can predict who has stainless steel arteries that go ahead and smoke till you're 100, you'll be fine, right? Versus somebody who has paper-thin garbage arteries that the toxin is going to cause them cardiovascular disease before it causes something else. So that's also there, right? So those are the systems that typically, if you look at anything that's functional, that's what you would look at. Yeah. How does the data deliver to you? Or how? Oh, protect it. Yeah, this is important. I would tell you that I would assume if you're doing a genetic test that your data is being sold, right? Just assume it. Why? Because it's the only thing that you only have to do once. It doesn't change. So it's not a good business to be in, right? Any other blood work is like you repeat. So every genetic testing company selling your data, we're a clinic, right? So the testing is not the business per se. We have thousands of people that from all over the world work with us on telemedicine. That's our business. And so my personal policy is there's an incinerator in the lab, test gets done, and it gets thrown in a fire. Literally, there's an incinerator in the middle of the lab, right? And so nobody's ever tempted to steal or sell, or it's destroyed right after the testing. So it was done that way intentionally because that is a very tempting thing. And who knows, the company gets sold one day, somebody else might sell the data, right? So yeah, but assume your data is being sold if you do a genetic test. Good? All right, guys. Good talking to you. Thanks.